Good morning. Welcome to today's virtual policy forum, A New Era for UN Peace Operations Transitions, co-hosted by the International Peace Institute and the Permanent Mission of Germany to the United Nations. I'm Jake Sherman, the Senior Director for Programs at IPI. Today's discussion marks the conclusion of a 3-year project on the transition of UN peace operations at IPI, and will reflect on the trends and challenges affecting current and upcoming reconfigurations of UN peace operations, as well as evolving UN policies, practices, and lessons, and what their implications are for the ongoing transitions in Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, and the process underway in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'd like to begin by first inviting Ambassador Christoph Heustchen, the permanent representative of the Permanent Mission of Germany to the United Nations, to make opening remarks. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Jake. It's a pleasure to participate in today's webinar, but let me first say how much we appreciate the cooperation with IPI. We have done that over many years, and also during the 2 years that we were in the Security Council, it was extremely helpful to work with IPI, for instance, on one of the key issues that were on our agenda, climate and security. We had a wonderful cooperation and a lot of insights that we gained thanks to IPI. And when we picked the theme transition to work with IPI for the last 3 years, we didn't know at that time how relevant that theme would be for our time in the Security Council, because, and I want to concentrate on that in my few introducing remarks, how relevant this would be for Sudan. Before I do that, I would like to recognize again the ability of IPI to gather speakers, and I'm very impressed by the great lineup of speakers that we got today. As I said, a few opening remarks. Peacekeeping operations by definition are temporary. Although in some instances, when you look like at Monusco and a few others, you have the impression they are there for almost permanent, but they are not designed, and they shouldn't be. They are temporary, and by definition, when you have something temporary, you have to see how you work best in the transition. You have to see where the different functions that the peacekeepers were implementing, who takes care of those, and that the governments are ready to take up the different tasks. And so we have to look at that. Of course, all cases are different, but I think there are some, and we'll find this out today, I'm sure there are some generalities, there are some features that are common to these kind of situations which we have been facing in Sudan. Sudan, for us, has been a key country. We, during the time in the Security Council, we were together with the United Kingdom co-pen holder for the file. We have been also supporting Sudan with a group of friends, and we tried also, to get donors to contribute. We have also now the SRSG for Sudan is a German, Mr. Pertes. This all demonstrates how much Sudan is important to us. We have been active in the Peace Building Commission. Germany is I think even the largest donor to the Peace Building Fund, and we have been involved also with the Peace Building Commission and its activities on Sudan. So a number of reasons why Sudan worked. Let me now, before we go then to the real specialist, let me just give you a bit improvised the impressions that I had as Germany's representative in the Security Council. We were, of course, very interested to have a smooth transition. We always thought that we cannot, just go by theory and say, well, this is our this is the roadmap, and no matter what happens on the ground, this is how we implement it. We always said, well, we have to try to adapt it to the developments. Therefore, we were always looking for some flexibilities with regard to the timing. To manage this in a right way, and I think this is a general remark, you need a number of preconditions. The first one, and the most important one, is to have council unity. And on that, there was basically an agreement. But when you look at then the details, in particular, when it came to managing, the roadmap, etc., we had some problems. We wanted to see to it also that, taking into consideration the situation on the ground, that we were not necessarily determined to have UNAMID drawdown at the end of this last year. We would have been ready to extend it a bit more. Because the peace agreement there, the Juba Peace Accord, didn't encompass everybody. The situation was not as stable. So there were the council was divided on this. There were some who said no way that we will prolong it after 31st of December. Others were with us saying, yes, let's look on the ground. And then the second issue was in the council. It's one of the largest UN missions, and also after they leave, after the mandate runs out, the operation ran out for the drawdown, you need a resolution because there still will be UN personnel on the ground, and also for their standing, also towards the government, and for their legitimacy. Or legality, you needed a resolution. But there again, we hit a roadblock. There was no chance to get a resolution in the end. We got a presidential statement, which is still good as a basis, but we would have preferred a mandate. Also, what is the situation on the ground? We wanted also ideally to see to it that with regard to the most important task of UNAMID, that was, from our perspective, the protection of civilians, that we still had some kind of leftover mandate, that even during the transition there would have maybe a chance to do something there. That was out of the question. No more executive mandate. Russia and others, and the Africans were in favor, saying no. We want to get the UN out. We want to have the national government, take over sovereignty. So in the end, it works out, but it was not as smooth as I would have liked it. Second, you need the buy-in, of course, of the government. The government needs to be ready to take over the task when the peacekeepers leave. Somebody else has to look after protection of civilians. We were not convinced that the Sudanese were able to do that. But also the Sudanese government, they were eager of, establishing their national sovereignty and taking control of the region. They had, UN who have been there long enough now. We take over. We were skeptical, and very briefly after we left in January, you remember there were again civilians that were killed, and in Darfur the situation were not as we had envisaged. Also, what is good in transitions that you have government unity. We had, during the last years, when it came to the drawdown, we got different signals. Prime Minister Hamdok was very cooperative. He remains our very good interlocutor. At the same time, of course, the agreement that we have in Sudan with the military also still playing a very important role. Our impression was the military were more keen on having the peacekeepers leave than the civilians were. So also there, but I mean, this is a general remark on Sudan. Of course, after the peaceful revolution in this country, all the different forces still have to see that they work in a coherent way. Overall, I must say the cooperation with Prime Minister Hamdok was well. Then, when it comes to Also, the next issue is I said about the mandate. What kind of mandate does it have? And then the drawdown. We talked to the Secretariat about the drawdown, and it was clear the impression that this is something that the UN has not done regularly. There was a big mission for many years, and to draw down, to transport everything out, to this cost a lot of money. And what we have seen is there that also the readiness of the council members or of the UN in general when it comes to budget relations to have the budget available for a drawdown for the transport of all this equipment. This is something that may seem to be a detail, but I think in practical purposes this is important. Then of course transition. I was talking about UNAMID. Now let's talk about UNITAMS. I think it went well with regard to the establishment of UNITAMS, but again the discussion was the same as with UNAMID when it comes to executive mandate, when it comes to the role of protection of civilians. How much does this new mission get a task which goes into this direction, which of course then has some influence on the national sovereignty, etc. So to do that was a challenge, but in the end, I think we got a very good UNITAMS mandate. The next challenge, again, when you get this mandate, is the implementation. You have to have the people, and again, you have to have the finances. If you believe that once you have an agreement in the council, this doesn't mean that you have the agreement in the fifth committee. And there, when countries like Germany, all those who really work on UN principles, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, believe it's very important that you have human rights components there. And then you have to see the reality in the fifth committee, where there are some countries that try to prevent that you get the money for human rights defenders there and all this. So it's something, a battle that is not over once you get a mandate in the Security Council, but then you have to go over to the fifth committee. Last remark, you have to have the council, you have to have the government, you have to have, or second last government, you have to have the regional cooperation. The UN has a good cooperation with the African Union. My impression is that the African Union is very keen always on African sovereignty and African African solutions to African problems. Sometimes I would wish to have the African Union more understanding that maybe it would not be as that bad if also for protection of civilians the UN stayed a bit longer, and that would be emphasized. And then last point, but it is key, and on Sudan, on other issues, don't get me wrong, cooperation between UN and AU is key, and I think we have to work on that and improve it. Last point, you have to have a UN encompassing UN component there. You need the country team, you need all the UN agencies, and I come back to what I said at the beginning. I think we need to involve more, get used to having the Peace Commission, the Peace Support Office involved, because there are means at the disposal of the UN, also of the country team, of the government there, which are key to use in transition. Last point, in transition, in all these decisions in the country, involve civil society. Women, children, have to be involved, have to be part of it, that it's not something that, is done in the capitals and Security Council and the cabinet in Khartoum, but civil society being involved. So there are many aspects. I just told you a bit my improvised impression from what happened and happens in Sudan. We will remain engaged. Sudan is so important, and that it gets right, and we'll outside the Security Council will continue to support the Sudanese government and of course UNITAM. So back to you, Jake.
Many thanks, Ambassador. Your very candid remarks, I think, from your time on the council were very much appreciated, and it's great to see a German national taking over the leadership of UNITAM. So we know that Germany will remain interested and engaged, including in the Peace Building Commission. I think you raised a number of issues that I have no doubt we're going to come back to throughout the course of the panel, but the importance of council unity, the tension often between the end date versus end state argument, the importance of host state buy-in, and you highlighted this particular point of inflection in Sudan where we saw the popular revolution. Of course, the issue of inclusivity, but one point that you raised that I think is particularly relevant, not just for Sudan, but for a whole range of upcoming transitions, including we'll hear shortly about the situation in Monusco, and that is, of course, what to do with continued protection concerns at the moment when the UN is configuring from large multidimensional missions with a uniform component to other, having to look at other resources, including civilian functions, to continue to provide that protection assurance. So many thanks for your comments, and many thanks to Germany for its continued support for the project. Let me now turn to our panelists. Our first speaker will be Daniel Forti, my colleague at IPI. He's a senior policy analyst and the author of the recent report, Walking a Tightrope, the Transition from UNAMID to UNITAMS in Sudan. He'll be followed by Rania Dagash Kamara, the Chief of Policy and Best Practice Service at the UN Department of Peace Operations. Then we'll hear from Rachel Scott, Senior Policy and Partnerships Advisor at the UN Development Program, and then Syria Maniam, the Senior Transition Advisor for the UN Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO. So Daniel, let me begin with you with an overview of some of the main lessons and challenges coming out of the project, their implications for Sudan and for the future of transitions. Over to you.
Colleagues, it's a pleasure to speak with you today to discuss UN peace operations transitions. IPI has focused extensively on this subject over the past 3 years. We've put out 9 publications and convened 4 standalone events during this time, many of them done in strong partnership with the German government. We also greatly appreciate our collaboration with the UN Transitions Project, which has been at the forefront of the organization's efforts to prepare for and support these complex processes. Since IPI began this project, we've seen the entire UN community become seized with transitions. For example, the Security Council and the Peace Building Commission have convened both country-specific and thematic discussions solely dedicated to transition processes. The topic was also considered as part of the first preparatory conference on peacekeeping and sustaining peace as part of the run-up to the 2021 Peacekeeping Ministerial Conference hosted by the Republic of Korea. And also the Secretary General has consistently prioritized transitions in the UN's work, whether in the context of the UN Sustaining Peace Agenda, his Action for Peacekeeping initiative, or across the various reform streams in the organization. Given this growing focus, it's important to underscore some of the takeaways that we have learned about UN transitions. I will discuss only a select few, since many of the colleagues on this panel will delve deeper into others. First, shared political strategies between the Security Council, the host country, and their partners is foundational for effective transitions. These strategies need to lay out the priorities, responsibilities, and trajectory of UN engagement. Thinking about the end state, the conditions in which a mission should reconfigure or leave, is important for defining concrete steps needed to reach that point. But building a shared political strategy, naturally, is easier said than done. As Ambassador Huysken mentioned, council members don't often share uniform positions, and its decisions need to be negotiated in the context of the interests of council members, various national actors, and their regional partners. Second, national ownership is important for the sustainability of these processes. Cooperation between the host state and the UN can help identify clear priorities and build trust during transitions. But national ownership is not just about host governments, and it requires the UN to consistently engage with the populations it serves, especially outside of capital. The UN also finds itself having to be sensitive to the inherent trade-offs of balancing national priorities with its own internal analyses throughout transition settings, especially around sensitive political issues like the protection of civilians or on democratic governance reforms. Third, integrated planning efforts need to span the entire UN system. Clear goals, shared analysis, operational flexibility, and coordination across multiple layers of the organization, both horizontal and vertical, all factor into successful transitions. These efforts are especially helpful when realigning peace-building initiatives amidst the UN's changing footprint and resources. Integrated planning is a massive and complex undertaking for the UN, especially considering that the missions and UN agencies and country teams need to undertake this planning while simultaneously delivering on their respective mandates. And fourth, strong partnerships between the UN, neighboring countries, regional organizations, international donors, and multilateral financial institutions are valuable for helping complement the UN's own efforts and sustaining international attention during transition settings. So many of the issues I've just outlined come to the fore in the context of the UN's ongoing transition in Sudan. This has been a particular area of focus for me over the past 2 years, and as Jake mentioned, we just published a new paper on this subject. The research during that paper focused largely on the period between October 2019, when political momentum picked up for the possibility of a new mission to replace UNAMID, until January 2021, when UNAMID closed and UNITAMS began delivering against all of its strategic priorities. I'm going to give an incredibly light summary of the report here, and I'll gladly go in deeper into different aspects of the research and the recommendations in the Q&A. The UN transition in Sudan continues to be one of the most complex reconfigurations the organization has ever attempted. After nearly 20 months of engagement and planning, which is detailed throughout the report, the UN finds itself walking a tightrope as it reconfigures its support to the country, which is undergoing its own fragile political transition. The paper argues that the UN has forged a clear but narrow path for sustaining its support to Sudan's transition. To keep this process moving forward, the paper puts forward 7 recommendations to the UN system and 3 more to UN member states. And I briefly just want to touch on 4 of the total 10 recommendations. First, I encourage the UN to articulate a forward-looking political compact with Sudan. This compact could outline the parameters for what the UN and the Sudanese would consider to be a successful political transition, along with the minimum conditions for UNITAMS to end its engagement. It could also identify how the mission can sequence its mandate, propose benchmarks for the Security Council, and identify potential gaps in UN support across the country. UNITAMS is particularly leveraged to facilitate an inclusive consultation process, which would also be beneficial in helping it build relationships with the wider Sudanese population. Second, I encourage the UN to expand support for urgent peacebuilding and protection priorities in Darfur in order to reduce the potential of a destabilizing security gap. The UN could accelerate its work with local government authorities, civil society organizations, and community leaders to develop projects and protection hotspots. And this would largely build on much of the good work that UNAMID did over the past 2.5 years in precisely these types of efforts. Additional investment by the Peacebuilding Fund could offer a lifeline for the projects until the envisioned multi-partner trust fund in Sudan is operational and sufficiently resourced. Third, I encourage the UN to work with the Sudanese transitional government to provide regular updates on the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement and its national protection of civilians plans. The Sudanese government submitted 2 updates to the Security Council on its protection of civilians plan, one in September 2020 and one earlier this month. And these are useful models for the host state to concretely engage with the Security Council during transition processes, so it feels more like a collaborative dialogue and less of a monitoring function. These updates would be useful to help identify emerging implementation gaps, an area where international support or financial resources are urgently needed. And fourth, I encourage UN member states to increase their financial support to address Sudan's peacebuilding and development needs overall. There is a growing risk that the transition in Sudan will confront a financial cliff, even amidst an environment of larger donor enthusiasm and increasing bilateral investment in the country. This makes it imperative for Sudan and its international partners to build a common understanding of which bilateral and multilateral financial mechanisms can coherently support particular goals. So Jake, to briefly conclude, I just want to offer 2 or 3 points that I think transitions in the future will need to grapple with more concretely. First, as Ambassador Huyssin outlined, sustaining political unity during transition processes are likely to be more difficult in the coming years. Consensus within the Security Council is breaking down across many files, but we know that transition moments are not the time for council members to lose interest or unity in their underlying political engagements. Flexible, diverse groupings of member states, both formal and informal, with influence to support the host country during these periods will be useful to help fill these voids and ensure active council engagement. The UN will also need to continue embracing the spectrum of peace operations notion in order to better respond to difficult conditions in transition settings. And ideally, we hope that future transitions can deploy presences and have UN operations on the ground that blend various aspects of your traditional peacekeeping operations, special political missions, and country team configurations. And third, I think there's a lot of focus being placed on international financing, especially, in the context of Sudan. And I think our thinking will need to evolve beyond just the singular notion of donor fatigue. And I'm very happy that Rachel is here to give a lot more expertise and insights into some of that issues. So let me conclude there. Thank you once again to Germany for supporting this project and for our colleagues across the UN to really help us bring some useful and relevant work to the community.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a great encapsulation of some of the sort of common themes, I think, that we see throughout different transitions that Ambassador Huyssin referenced, but then bringing it down to look concretely at what that does look like in the context of Sudan's transition. And I think the complexity of actors, both at the sort of international level in the council and regional organizations, as well as within the government and the host society itself, have really been well highlighted and set us up for our next few speakers. So I'm now going to turn to Rania, and I think we'll hear a bit about how the UN's own approach to transitions, both within the Department of Peace Operations, but also across the UN system more broadly, has evolved over the past few years and where the current areas of focus are. So Rania, please.
Thank you very much, Jake. It's great to be here with you today, and a good morning to colleagues, to fellow panelists, and a huge thank you to Ambassador Huyssin also for hosting us today and providing this great opportunity. I too would like to echo the points the Ambassador made about how IPI has continuously supported us in its role to lead on critical issues that help us move policy agendas forward like this one. So congratulations also on the conclusion of the multi-year IPI project on transitions. Now, I will focus my narrative today on our own evolution, as you said, Jake. And while I could dialogue with Daniel on these findings for the rest of today, I'll just maybe focus on 3 things: our evolution, what we've managed to do, and where we remain challenged and require support. But as I like to do, I'd like to start with a story, if you allow me, Jake. And it covers a little bit what Daniel said about delivering on a mandate and yet being asked to plan a transition, and where we are today. In 2012, I was the senior strategic planner in UNPOS, which was a special political mission that worked on Somalia. And I remember very starkly the day my boss called me in and said, look, we're working on the election process now. It's critical. It is going to determine the future of Somalia's politics. And I know you're flat out, but we now know for sure that we're going to transition this mission out and a new political mission is going to come in. So start planning for that. I'm in the middle of organizing our coordination on the response to the elections, fundraising for it, all the support on logistics in Somalia. And I say, sure, no problem. And then I walk out of his office and I think to myself, oh my God, did he just say we're closing this mission and starting a new one? What am I going to do with that? How do I even do that? And then as a good UN bureaucrat, I remember thinking, calm down. Others must have done this before. And surely we will know, if I speak to a few of them, we'll chart our own path. And I hadn't realized how far we had come in the last 10 years, really, until 2 years ago. I was sitting in New York with a colleague planning a transition also for one of our countries, a UN transition. And she was just talking about the transition process with a lot of ease and issues I grappled with for months in 2012. And she's smarter, I give her that. But I said to her, how do you know all this? And she said, I did the transition projects training, and they've been a great resource that's helped me through a lot of this. So in summary, I think I just want to maybe showcase the evolution through this last decade that we've gone through and how we got to that. What's quite important, as some of you have already said, is realizing that this point of transition is a critical juncture for many host countries. It's often overlapping with a political transition, as I was just explaining in Somalia as well. Very high stakes, both politically in peace building and in development terms. And we know that from recent research that all that the UN operations have contributed in terms of peace building and development could be at stake. More specifically, I can refer to peacekeeping here. We recently found out in the UNDP study, actually, that FDI, foreign direct investment, as a percentage of GDP is about 2 percentage points higher. And real economic growth is 4% higher in post-conflict years after a peacekeeping presence. So all to say that the previous and hard-won gains can be lost. So it's quite a critical juncture just to solidify that point. Despite this, we knew that UN and member states' attention and resources on transitions had not been commensurate with the risk that this moment represents. So in 2014, the system, and specifically at the time DPA and DPKO, DFS and UNDP, created a UN transition project. And it was in response to this gap and to help people like me a few years before who were totally lost what to do with the transition context. And with the generous support of CEDA, really predominantly since 2014 and the UK more recently, the Transitions Project has managed to do 5 things, and I'll refer to another subset 5 shortly. They fundamentally serve as a one-stop shop for transition planning, management, and advocacy, both within the UN system and towards partners externally. 2, they directly support countries that are in transition. So like in my case, they would have probably deployed with a transition specialist or with someone to help us. They've done that in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea-Bissau, in Haiti, in Liberia, in Mali, and in Sudan. 3, they train and build capacity. So they've done that for 800 UN staff since their inception. And that's no small feat. One of them is my very smart colleague who was managing this transition. And raves about how much it opened her eyes to what needs to be done and the flow of a transition. So I cannot emphasize how the training and capacity building enough has been critical. 4, they've managed to capture and share lessons and good practices, and even bad ones for that matter, between the different transition contexts that we've managed. And they've helped close the organizational knowledge gaps on recurring challenges. They've looked specifically at UN benchmarking. They've looked at financing transitions. They've looked deeply into sustaining political engagement and into, of course, Security Council practices in mandating transitions. You're familiar with all of this, but I think it's important to reflect it also to all colleagues who are with us today. And then finally, they've enhanced our own UN policies and practice in transitions. And while they play a catalytic role in influencing these policy streams, they've contributed to developing a UN transition policy. They've also helped with the review of the integrated assessment and planning policy, the IAP, which was, you know, a lifesaver for me in early days, the IMPP, its predecessor, and the Secretary General's Transition Planning Directive. So institutionally, they've helped to do a lot since their inception. Now, we've had 12 transitions, UN transitions, since 2008. And there's been cumulative learning. And of course, with the project's inception and all of that, we've come a long way in how we conceptualize, plan, and manage these transitions. So what have we achieved? And there are 5 other subset points here I'd like to flag. The UN's thinking has definitely shifted from viewing transitions as a handover of residual activities, because that's exactly what I was doing in 2012 and early 2013. Who do I give this mandate to? And almost always, UNDP, take as much as you can of this. And so I think there's been a major shift in thinking through. It isn't a handover of residual activities. So it's a more forward-looking approach that aims to support national stakeholders and priorities, as Daniel was referring. So, and it consolidates these peace gains. 2, I think this Secretary General has placed transitions quite high on his agenda, and he has regular meetings on it at the highest levels at the Executive Committee. He put in place the Transition Planning Directive I was referring to earlier. And it requires, interestingly, all peace operations to articulate, together with their UNCT counterparts, an integrated transition calendar, which serves as a roadmap for transition planning. So no one's ever caught in my position in 2012. It becomes part of the vernacular of a mission, part of the conversation, and it's a continuum rather than a point in time. 3, I think the UN's commitment to better plan and manage transitions also shifted with the Secretary General's support, and with the reform specifically of both the peace and security pillars and the development side. And I think that's highlighted in Action for Peacekeeping, in the Sustaining Peace agenda, and there's a lot of lessons that are feeding into the integration review. 4, the Peace Building Fund, which has created a transition financing window to channel the much needed funding to catalyze this peace building capacity and to avoid this cliff that Daniel was referring to, and I'm sure Rachel will refer to in more detail. Then finally, member states have been an absolute game changer in this context, and in how they've improved transitions. You know, I've often argued that the easiest transitions are the ones where the Security Council is fully supportive or totally indifferent. And many times we don't find ourselves in that position at all. So the Council has dedicated time to look into transitions. There was a retreat 2 years ago, open debate, several technical discussions since then. They're educating themselves. And I think that has also produced a different dynamic for the system at large. The Peace Building Commission has supported transitions. Those who worked on Sierra Leone would argue that it was critical, the role that the PBC played after the mission closed, because they maintained the visibility on the Sierra Leone situation, the needs, and kept it at quite a high level at the time. So they did the same with Liberia and with Guinea-Bissau at the moment, so quite central to them. And I just wanted to recognize these 5 points. Now, we also know that a lot of the innovation comes from our missions. And here I just want to share 2 or 3 interesting evolutions and innovations that have come from our missions. Liberia transitioned in 2018 from a peacekeeping mission to a strengthened resident coordinator's office. Now, it's the only resident coordinator's office I had seen that had a full political team embedded in recognition of the fragility of the context, the importance of politics in this context, but the mission had done its time, and there was a different configuration needed for the UN, but a very creative configuration, and one that assessed contributions supported actually for some time, even after the mission had officially closed. So the RC office was certainly better equipped in a sense to support the host country and the UN country team at large, and the UN system even larger, in much better stead than many of his predecessors had. And it worked on a lot of prevention work actually through excellent analysis and good offices, working with our regional office in West Africa with UNOS. Haiti, the transition planning was anchored in the new cooperation framework. Again, a fantastic innovation that made it more focused on adjusting and enhancing the UNCT programming with national priorities and plans. And then in Sudan, we saw the state liaison functions that were created basically by UNIMID to support integration with the country team on key priority areas, the areas that I wanted to hand off in 2012 to anyone. And so UNIMID's been very smart about creating these teams that are embedded in the country team agencies across multiple agencies that worked on rule of law, justice, protection, all of these critical areas that we knew required support after exiting. I'll try to wrap up, Jake. So I think the next thing I want to highlight is, I'm not going to talk of any country situation in depth, because I think also Syria will talk to UNIMID or Monusco in a lot more detail. But looking ahead is where I want to close with. And that's about maintaining a sustained and a UN-wide focus on reconfiguration and drawdown and transition processes. We know that a transition project, as we've been running it, can't run forever, and that transition capacities have to become integral to the organization's practice and planning culture beyond this project, brilliant as it may be. So the project aims to strengthen and anchor transition-related resources in the organization. And I think this will include establishing a talent pool of experts, both UN and consultants, with a variety of skill sets and experience that can be integrated into existing UN rosters to facilitate rapid deployment. And of course, the project will continue to focus on building capacities of the relevant UN entities where needed and across the system. So we know that strengthening our own system on transitions is essential, because we're dealing with increasingly transition context. My own boss, Mr. Lacroix, often says, every mission is in transition, right? Echoing the Secretary General. And if that's the case, then our own capacities have to align to that. There's unfinished political settlements, there's persisting instability, and there's continued protection concerns, as the ambassador noted. So there's a lot that has to be covered, and our understanding of that has to continue evolving. So we're likely to face considerable challenges in sustaining this and sustaining peace, actually, in some of these countries. So once these missions have departed, it's imperative for the UN and its member states to accelerate the collective efforts, which will help shape UN transitions ultimately. We have a great opportunity with the peacekeeping ministerial coming up, and that's likely to occur towards the end of next year. And while peacekeeping ministerials they go beyond our military and police capabilities and take a broader view of peacekeeping, there's been an incredible also innovation in member state support. So we know that member state support is needed to strengthen strategic planning, capacities, including gender-sensitive analysis and programming to provide coherent support to host countries and communities. And allow me to just manage the kitchen, 1 second. right? Very important cooking session going on there. So my point is member state support is needed to strengthen strategic planning capacities, including our gender sensitive analysis and programming to provide coherent support to these countries and communities that we support. So we need member states to ensure adequate, predictable, and sustained resources for peace building activities rather. And this includes coordinating financial support, which Rachel will elaborate on much more, to prevent this cliff. We have, in the preparatory meetings of the Peacekeeping Ministerial, 3 focus areas that are essential for transitions and their success: women, peace and security in transitions, institution building and training in transition contexts, and financing in transition contexts. And these thematic discussions will certainly bring out many important points and recommendations that we can continue to discuss. I'll stop there, Jake, and forgive me if I've crossed time.
Thanks so much, Rania. I mean, there was, you know, I was aware that we were going on a bit long, but there was so much that you were covering, and I definitely wanted to give you the space to say it. You know, just a few things. I mean, one is that you almost glossed over it, but in a way, there's been this tremendous shift in the UN's thinking from this idea of the handover to actually supporting and empowering national stakeholders to consolidate peace gains. And it is interesting that it almost seems now that the department, as we've seen the consolidation and transition on a number of missions, you're now in a moment where you're thinking about how the department can continue to provide onward support to follow-on presences, whether they're at special political missions or UN country teams, even after the withdrawal of a peacekeeping mission, in order to continue sustaining peace. I know Rachel has a hard stop at 9:30, so we're going to quickly transition over to her. There have been several references to sustaining financing in transitions, and of course the role of UNDP has been mentioned. So Rachel, please, without further ado, let me turn to you. And I know you've got a few slides you want to throw up on the screen.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks everyone. And just while Amanda's putting the slides up, so yes, thanks IPI for inviting us to this very important event on this very, very important subject that's very close to my heart. This is a study that was done in my previous incarnation leading the OECD's crisis and fragility work. It was a study done jointly between the UN Transition Project that Rania mentioned before and the International Network on Conflict and Fragility, which of course is co-chaired by Germany and the UK. So nice to see Germany here today as well to talk about that. So next slide, please. So the study was all about looking at the principles for development finance around sort of 3 areas that people have been talking about and actually has come up today. Well, the peacekeeping economy hasn't come up today, but I'm going to talk about it, so at least it will come up then. So looking at the negative economic impacts and disruptions that the peacekeeping economy can play in a transition setting. The financial cliff, you've heard that word said today already, so that's certainly part of the lexicon, so I'm going to talk about that a bit as well. And how do you sustain domestic economic growth post-transition and during and post-transition, and what does that actually mean in terms of the stability and maintaining peace gains, as was said before. There were 4 case studies under this, of course, all in different stages of their transitions. Liberia, long past. Haiti was mid-transition, actually, when the study took place. DRC, of course, in the middle of its transition, and Sudan similarly had just started, in fact, when we were there looking at that, and things have progressed, of course, significantly since then. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about transitions and the role that, good planning, which was talked about before. I won't talk too much about it, but I just talk about the impact that can have on how you can finance and how you can plan for financing. I look at post drawdown financing. So, what happens to those projects that are left unfinished, and how do we sustain capacity gains post withdrawal? And then a little bit on the peacekeeping economy, just because that hasn't come up so much today, but I think it's such a critical factor to take into account as we're going through. Next slide, please. So, the speakers before me have very eloquently laid out, why it's important to sort of have a proper mandate for these things and to do the planning in a kind of organized and structured way. And nowhere is that more important than around the financing. If we don't know what the exit triggers are, when a mission is going to leave, we don't know what the timelines are for that hour. And of course, in Liberia, those were stretched significantly on multiple occasions. And it's very, very hard to sustain the right type of financing and create the appetite for investment going forward. So when you're thinking about the mandate and the drawdown timelines, don't just think about it in terms of the programming, but also in terms of how you're going to keep the money and have the right money at the right time. And linked to that, what is the narrative around the transition? And this is very important if you're going to attract extra funding, whether that be public or private, post drawdown. So, why are we drawing down? What is that for? And of course, in recent years, that hasn't been quite as clear as we would have liked it to have been. Sending a clear message that we are leaving, the peace operation is leaving because, there is now peace and we're open for business and it's time to sort of kickstart the economy is a very different message to what perhaps has happened in recent years. Thinking about what's normative and what's programmatic in terms of what the mission does, and which is then of course financed in very different ways going forward. So not just thinking of it as a sort of one solid pack, but breaking that up into investable pieces, which might be some of the programs, and then normative that you might need to think about a different funding model going forward. And then, and I cannot insist on this enough, making the transition plan fully inclusive. And when I talk about that, really broadening it out beyond just a UN plan, whether that's between the mission or between UN Blue, if you like, but also bringing in the bilaterals very early on, bringing in the IFIs, thinking about how to involve the private sector, civil society, and especially the government, who is of course going to have to make budget allocations for some of these things going forward. So moving along to the next slide, please. So financing the transition, I think it's come up a bit today, but the fact that there are assessed contributions that fund what happens while the mission is in place can sort of lead to complacency, I suppose, and create the sort of expectation gap that, well, we fund, someone else funded it before, and so someone else will keep funding it now. And so how do we sort of deal with that expectation gap and really sort of manage that going forward? We also have to invest in financing the planning of the transition, and perhaps Syria can speak to us a little bit more about this as well. We can't just expect people to sort of, after their day jobs in the evening, also plan the transition and do all the analysis and evidence collecting and things to make sure that happens. So making sure there's the right capacity in place on the ground to do that is very important. I'll talk a lot more about the macroeconomic impact of peacekeeping, but really, let's not forget that when you have a huge peace operation on the ground, I mean, that does have a significant economic impact on what's going on in the country. So, we need to take that seriously. And there are some innovations in terms of financing that are coming up. That it's been really useful to be able to do joint programming between UN agencies and the mission with the sort of joint assessed contributions, especially towards the transition phase. So, let's think about some more of those innovations and flexible financing mechanisms that can be used to help this out. Next slide, please. So what is the role for the UN country team? I think there are a lot of tools out there that are being used and constantly improved, which is fantastic to sort of support the a better transition, and as Rania said, not just a handover. The capacity of assessment, for example, is a really interesting tool, looking at what capacity exists in the UN country team and what needs to be added. Sadly, it often comes up with the same recommendation, and that is that there is no office for human rights on the ground, and that they should deploy. So perhaps the capacity of assessment could go further than that and think really about what programming capacities do exist on the ground as well, and what needs to be strengthened. Rania mentioned the good officers. I think the good officers is really critical, and absolutely in Liberia, there was a political function that was transferred over from the mission to the resident coordinator's office, which was super helpful in terms of maintaining that capacity for good officers. The financing for that those political officers who got moved over was not, of course, secured from the beginning. And in fact, I remember the story of one staff member in particular was almost in the car on the way to the airport when he learned that his contract had been extended. So we do have to think also about the financing of that good offices and those functions that are needed to be attached to that. And then also sort of resourcing the resident coordinator's office so they have the right planning capacity. I spoke about that before. That was particularly, you know, Rania talked about, you know, innovations in the Haiti context. There weren't really enough staff on the ground to make that happen and to drive that forward. So, you know, do we have to scale up the resident coordinator's office presence during transitions to make sure this happens, and who's going to pay for that? And then also deciding on what should be passed over to the UN country team. I think at the moment we do have this idea that at the end of the mission, we will pass everything over to the country team, and then the country team has to sort of pick that up and finance it. We'll find some way of getting some kind of sustainable financing for it. But actually, you know, a lot of what is being handed over could go to other partners. I mean, bilateral donors might be able to take on some of these functions. Some of them might be more usefully passed to the IFIs. Some of them might be in terms of, you know, passing them directly over to the government and just ensuring that there is absorption capacity in the government for doing that. And that will create a very different funding model. So at the moment, what you have is a handover of everything to the country team. The country team goes, oh, where's the money going to come from? And then puts out a sort of appeal, if you like, or looks for a multi-donor trust fund or something like that to make it happen. But perhaps, you know, in different contracts, there are different actors available who might also be able to take this on and relieve some of the pressure on the country team in terms of finding, you know, funding for sometimes huge amounts of programming going forward. Next slide, please. The financial cliff, and I do have a question mark after that because I'm not entirely convinced, to be honest. And actually, in a lot of the case studies, you know, the amount of extra funding that was required post-departure was really tiny. It was looking, you know, 20 billion mark kind of thing. So we're not necessarily always speaking about huge amounts of money either. I think a lot more of it is around the expectation gap that I mentioned before, you know, that Security Council priorities and what is set out in the mandate in terms of the transition period will be automatically funded. But of course, the gap between when the Security Council decides on the mandate and when it gets around to when the Budget Committee gets around to allocating the budget is quite significant, and lots of things can happen in between those two. For example, a global pandemic that might skew entirely the priorities of member states and mean that they're not sort of so interested in allocating as much funds as required to deliver the mandate that they've actually given to the mission, which makes it complicated. Is there donor fatigue? In none of the case studies did there appear to be any donor fatigue in terms of it, you know, making sure that there was enough ODA or enough aid money going into these countries. But where there wasn't donor fatigue, and in that donors were not leaving the country, nor drawing down programs, nor downsizing their contributions in these places, the donors there were not actually upsizing either to take into account the fact that new things needed to be funded. And they were not interested in reallocating money from their existing program. So taking money from a water program, for example, and putting it into a justice program that hadn't been finished off quite by the mission. So there isn't donor fatigue, if you like, but there isn't the surge that is actually required to fund these things post-departure. So as Min mentioned before, as a lifeline, I suppose, many UN country teams are in these transition phases turning to the Peace Building Fund as really the only instrument that is out there at the moment that is getting significant allocations to these types of things. Multi-donor trust funds, just as a sort of sideline, you know, really are not very attractive for most bilateral donors at the moment. They haven't proven attractive in transition settings in the past. So either we have to think about how we sell those better to donors, or maybe we need to think about whether this is the right instrument. Next slide, please. So one important thing we also forget, I think, sometimes in transitions is how do we sustain the capacity gains that have already been made? We focus very much on the fact that the justice program hasn't quite been finished off yet, and we've got to get enough funding for that justice program to be finished. But we forget that actually a lot of the gains that have been made also need funding just to be sustained. Here, general budget support, and I know that is not an exciting thing to do anymore, and there's not a lot of donor interest in providing general budget support, but if that can happen, it would be a tremendous lifeline for a lot of these places. How do we sustain capacity outside of the capital city as well? So, you know, peace operations often have significant presence outside of the capital city, where they deliver services. They provide sometimes a de facto type of administration as well. Often what we're not thinking about how to fund that beyond the capital city type of work either. How do we work on a financing strategy for capacity, and especially for security, which is often directly handed back to the government, but we're not actually helping the state raise domestic resources so that it can deliver those security services. I remember in Kinshasa, when I went down to the Ministry of Finance and asked them about what they sort of thought of as a unit cost for funding security after the peacekeeping mission had drawn down and things, not even started thinking about it. So I mean, hopefully things have improved since then, but certainly there hadn't been any thinking about how much it was going to cost, let alone how that was going to be funded. Is really quite frightening. A lot of peacekeeping assets get handed over after missions leave. There's sort of a great wind down, and the stickers get taken off the back and they get handed over, and then they disappear very quickly. And the story of the cars parked out in Liberia, parked in front of the parliament, that was sort of one by one driven away, and nobody knew where they went. In Haiti, I actually physically watched furniture being moved out of offices the day after it had been handed over. And the fact that it disappeared, okay, fraud, whatever. But it's the fact that the capacity disappeared as well. Those cars that were going to be used to deliver services and help government officials get around and things has gone. That's a deal. So how do we make sure that those peacekeeping assets remain and the incentives are there? The mission's public goods need to be financed as well. In DRC, for example, the humanitarians are very concerned about who's going to maintain the landing strips in some of these far-flung places and who's going to pay for that. Some of the other things, becoming a troop contributing country can be very helpful. Liberia is now a troop contributing country, which has allowed it to have a revenue inflow as well as incentive to keep up training and uniforms and that type of thing and standards. So that's been very helpful. And then civil society is a big deal as well. So civil society are often, especially in the human rights sector, highly dependent on mission funding. So how do we make sure that civil society get what they need going forward? Next slide. Peacekeeping economy is a thing. I wasn't sure about where to study, but it certainly is a thing, and I'm fully convinced of that now. I mean, in Liberia, there was a significant peacekeeping economy, even though only a small percentage of what a peace operation actors are paid comes in country. That made enormous difference, and then what the mission was spending on local purchases, etc., was amazing. There was a whole speculative economy that had grown up around the peacekeeping and the peace operation, both in the capital and outside. In Haiti, there was a more limited impact. It did seem to have impact. We did a specific study on that and what kind of impact it had, and it was much more limited. In DRC, it's really interesting because it's very context specific. So the impact in Goma, for example, was enormous, where there were a lot of the mission troops are stationed. The investments in infrastructure, the building of services around that is critical. But then in places like Kasai, where the mission was sort of almost self-sufficient and not really reliant on the outlying community, there was much less of a peacekeeping economy in place. So it's very context specific. Providing security, the role of the mission in providing security is critical for economic stability as well. Securing roads and markets, and even allowing products like insurance, for example, to take place is really critical. And then the impact on national staff as part of the peacekeeping economy is something to take into account as well. Often they are laid off after the mission leaves. They don't often find other jobs, at least not at the same sort of revenue level. And what that means to the trickle-down economy, for the corner store where they've been buying their goods, for the staff they've been employing, for the purchases they've made, can be very significant, especially when they're a major part of the population. Sorry, I'm getting there. Mitigating the economic impact of withdrawal. First of all, we've got to guard against the masking effect. So in Liberia, there was significant economic growth while the mission was there, which meant that there was no incentive to deal with the underlying structural issues in the economy while the mission was present. So we have to be careful of that. we have to reach out to foreign investors right from the beginning of the transition to say that, you know, the country is now open for business. That's very hard to do, of course, in practice, but that's something that we need to get better at. We need to understand the peacekeeping economy and what impact that has had, and how we need to change things. Do we need to diversify the economy, for example, so that it's not so reliant on the peacekeeping economy going forward? What does it mean for the public-private mix? You know, where private investors should take control when public. We need to provide contingent financing for shocks. So this shocks will happen after the mission leaves, whether they are disasters or conflict. In Liberia, we had Ebola afterwards. In Haiti, we had the hurricanes that happened afterwards, and of course the price riots. In Sudan, there's been significant flooding, for example. How do we make sure that contingent financing is in place when the peacekeepers are no longer able to deliver support? And what other options are there in each particular context? And I'll just finish with, you know, sorry, the next slide. I'll just finish with what you, excuse the phrase, can do in these places. First of all, I think the UN system needs to be very, needs to understand more what needs to be passed on to themselves rather than being passed on to other actors, and anticipate those funding needs early on. At the moment, there's sort of a lot of programming going on, and then sort of, oh, where's the money going to come from? Whereas actually we need to be thinking about, oh, where's the money going to come from much further, much upstream. So unfinished projects like justice programs that are not completed, we need to have that handover based on comparative advantage. The UN system needs to be part of the design stage of those projects and not just sort of have to accept them as they come off the missions portfolio and into the country team. And then also, you know, thinking about really, should those programs have been in the country team from the beginning rather than in the mission if they're going to eventually be handed over to the country team anyway. And then also about capacity gains, for example, you know, taking over the QUIPS projects for civil society. I think UN Blue could be doing a lot more work on financing strategies early on in the transition about how that can happen, and bringing in that development economist expertise to be able to design these financing strategies. We could also be looking very more clearly at understanding the peacekeeping economy and how do we mitigate its presence and its loss. And then finally, we could be doing a lot more work around the humanitarian development peace nexus, making sure that humanitarian issues are inserted into development and peace operation programming right from the beginning, and therefore reducing the dependence on, you know, scarce and very precious humanitarian resources once the peace operation leaves. Thank you very much, and delighted to be part of this conversation.
Rachel, thanks so much, and apologies for again for kind of crimping you, knowing that you've got to leave. Very much appreciated the kind of forward-looking recommendations. I thought, you know, the point you made about there are capacities, whether it's good offices or planning capacity, that the resident coordinator's offices need to be enabled, but that also requires financing. And at least in some of the early transitions where that we've talked about, like Liberia, that wasn't always the case, and something that needs to be factored in to ensure that country teams have that ability to play that enhanced role. I was very struck by the point you made that maybe it's not actually about financial cliffs, but about expectation gaps, which is quite interesting. I'm gonna, if there are questions, I'm gonna ask you to drop them in the chat box. I'm optimistic that we'll at least be able to take one round of questions after Syria's comments. But Syria has been very patient, so we're gonna turn to her to give us the perspective of what this actually looks like on the ground in Monusco, and you've just come out of UNAMID, so I'm sure a lot of what we've been speaking about resonates. So please, Syria.
Well, we would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, and I would also like to express our DSRSG David McLaughlin's car's regrets for not being able to participate today due to competing priorities. However, I am very happy to represent him and to share the planning processes and the direction that Monusco is undertaking in support of transition for the DRC. We are at the beginning stage of this formal process. So I will talk a little bit about what we have been doing in terms of establishing the architecture in order to support the transition, and also share examples of what we have done in a couple of provinces. We are guided by the existing UN Secretariat policy requirement on UN transition, where we are ensuring that the UN leadership on the ground, that is both the mission and the UN country team, are coordinating closely with national partners, the UNCT at large, and also with UNHQ on the transition process. In addition to this, we are also drawing upon the SG's planning directive issued in early 2019 that initiated our transition planning, taking note that the overall responsibility and accountability for transition is resting with the head of mission, whilst the DSRSG RCHC takes the lead for the operational transition planning in integrated missions, of which Monusco is an integrated mission. In addition to that, we are also drawing upon the joint strategy on the progressive and phased drawdown of Monusco, which was discussed and agreed with the government last year, prior to its submission to the Security Council in October last year as well. The Council endorsed this joint strategy in mid-December last year through the resolution 2556, which also extended the mandate of Monusco for another year. So for us, we are looking at transitional planning has the need to cover the political and security aspects, program planning, where we will have to develop program planning in terms of development of priorities for transition, including the transfer of key tasks currently undertaken by the mission to relevant stakeholders. I am reminded of one of the panelists who had indicated that we shouldn't just look at it as transfer of residual tasks, but here I want to stress that we are looking at what are the key tasks that are currently undertaken by the mission that needs to be transferred to relevant stakeholders, that is the government, the UNCT, perhaps the country, the civil society, and other stakeholders on the ground, maybe international NGOs and national NGOs. In addition to that, we also have to look at the operational planning for the closure and exit of Monusco. Currently, in a lot of peacekeeping operations, drawing upon my experience with UNAMID, there is a lot of services that are provided by the mission, not only to the people of to the mission, but also to the UNCT. So we have to make sure that the operational planning for the closure does not leave a gap on the ground either. And a very key important point that was also mentioned earlier by a panelist, there is also the need for us to have links to external stakeholders, such as the civil society, humanitarian country team, community leaders and structures, in order to ensure that the priorities that are being developed are in line with what the community needs. And we also have to have a strong link with the donor community for resource mobilization, in order to ensure that we support achieving the desired medium and end state for successful exit of the mission. Our Security Council resolution requires that we also submit a joint transition plan to the Council by September of this year. And this is basically the translation of the endorsed joint strategy into key broad tasks and actions that needs to be met by the government, by the UN country team, and the mission. In order to do this, Monusco is going to be drawing upon existing coordination structures that are already in place to lead, guide, and support the development of this joint. Will also support the execution and the transition that needs to take place. At the strategic level, we see that a joint working group comprising of the government, UNCT, and Monusco representatives needs to be established in order to enhance coordination and planning for transition. This is also The Security Council resolution also clearly stated that this needs to be undertaken. And it also further requests that the joint working group works in close liaison with the civil society in the planning, in the coordination and planning for the transition. Working with the structure, we are going to be working with the structure that had supported the joint working group, that is. We are going to be working with the structure that supported the submission of the joint strategy last October. And in addition to that, we are also going to suggest that relevant key ministries are also included in this existing mechanism in order to ensure that we are inclusive. We are inclusive at the strategic level. There is the suggestion for 4 to 5 key work streams to be formed that will allow for a deeper discussion of priority program areas, thus ensuring that the key relevant divisions and departments of ministries are also engaged in the planning process. For example, we have been toying with a few work streams which are yet to be confirmed. We are thinking of work streams like the security and protection, rule of law and human rights, stabilization and peace building, governance and institutional strengthening, amongst others. Now that we have a joint working group at the strategic level, comprising of both a mission, UNCT and the government, we also need to ensure that at the technical level, there is also a coordination mechanism. We already have a mechanism that is the integrated transition team that was initiated last year. It comprises of senior program managers from both the mission and the UNCT. Like the joint working group, we would like to have similar work streams that mirror that will mirror the joint working group work streams as well. So this will ensure that not only at the technical working level, we have some level of linkage to the joint working group work streams, and to ensure that the transition planning and the priorities, objectives, and activities that we would like to undertake as part of the transition program is aligned. The ITT level will also ensure that there is constant engagement with the civil society, humanitarian, and community levels in support of the priorities and activities to be identified. As mentioned, what we will do is, in terms of developing the programmatic direction, we are going to be utilizing the Nexus approach, that is the humanitarian, peace building, and development axis, to be the guiding principle for the transition program planning. This is aimed at reducing and moving away from dependency on humanitarian interventions, and instead to upscale peace building and development interventions for sustainability of the transition process. In this regard, last year in October, a workshop had taken place where 4 key outcomes, where four collective outcomes were identified aimed at reducing the long-term humanitarian risk, vulnerabilities amongst the poorest and at-risk people in the DRC. They are food security and malnutrition, access to basic social services, population displacement, and gender-based violence. So already this was a consultative process. The workshop was attended by several ministries, international NGOs, local NGOs, and also the UN presence in the country. So we ensured that there was a collective process in terms of discussing as to how we can utilize the Nexus approach as the guiding principle for the transition process. Currently, the current joint transition process has also, we are not undertaking transition across the nation at the same time, but rather there is going to be a sequence planned transition process. whereby the closure of the Kasais region, two of the provinces in the Kasais region, will take place by the end of June this year. So the transition planning in this province is at an advanced stage, and a recent visit to the field, where I also participated last week, shows progress and continued interest of bilateral donors to the Nexus approach that has already been launched in the Kasais region. Next is the closure of Monusco locations in the Tanganyika province in the east. The integrated office, the head of office, Monusco office, has already initiated transition planning with the UN team, UN meaning both the mission and the UN country team, and also extended to the humanitarian country team as well. To support the team, and we will continue to provide guidance and support to the team with the development of their transition framework. The process that we would like to, as we continue to talk to the head of office there, what we would like to start off with is for them to come together to identify the priorities that are needed for the province, and thereafter to map the current ongoing programs that they have, and to also identify the funding sources that are currently supporting the various programs that are being undertaken. And then we will try to map these towards the Nexus process, approach that we would like to undertake, which will allow us to further identify the funding gaps that are required in order to achieve the transition framework. As mentioned earlier by a panelist, funding is going to be a major key player, a major source that needs to be addressed from early on, and I couldn't agree with her more. But at the same time, I also want to ensure that the interests, the large interests of funders will not overshadow in terms of trying to ensure that the priorities, the identified priorities, continue to remain valid and addressed. That is, in the conflict in the three provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu, we will not initiate the transition framework yet, but rather we are going to be consolidating the activities, the peacekeeping activities in the eastern region due to the continued security instability. The mission will continue to facilitate withdrawal from these provinces. The mission will continue to address the root causes of the conflict through in these provinces through a targeted and coordinated approach towards stabilization. Currently, the stabilization section unit has a strategy where they are working on 5 pillars. These are ensuring that democratic dialogue continues to take place with the local authorities, addressing the security, restoration of state authority in these provinces, and also the return and reintegration of displaced persons, including ex-combatants, and ensuring that there's some form of economic development activities available for these return of displaced persons, and also supporting the women, peace, and security agenda. So in order to ensure that we are able to withdraw from these three provinces, we have to ensure that we are able to support the 5 pillars of the stabilization strategy in order to start planning our transition out of these 3 provinces. Not to forget, our governance structure will also ensure that we continue to have ongoing engagement with our HQ counterparts, mainly the Integrated Task Force. This is the representatives of the UNCT that are present at the HQ level. And we will also continue to work with our integrated operating team for the DRC, who are more connected towards the dialogues and towards the interactions with the member states, relevant member states who have an interest in the DRC, and also other stakeholders that are present at the HQ level. We will also continue to receive technical support from the transition project, the joint transition project that is headed by that Rania is supporting, and we continue to draw lessons learned from other missions that have gone through transition or going through transition, and likewise we will also be sharing our experiences with them. There has been some movements at the mission level. We will be receiving our SRSG next week, and the DSRSG for the protection and operations will be arriving in a couple of weeks. And at the same time, the DRC is also going through, undergoing some changes politically as well. And we expect to have the Prime Minister had announced, the newly elected Prime Minister has announced that the new lineup of the team will be announced in early March, which is basically next week. So we look forward to the arrival of the SRSG, and together with the UNCT and the mission leadership to help initiate discussions with the joint working group. And to keep momentum and to keep the transition process on track. Lastly, we are also, as mentioned earlier, the joint strategy was endorsed by the Security Council in December. So what we are also doing right now is we are developing a transition narrative, an overall transition narrative, for submission to the SRSG and for her further discussion with the mission leadership on taking this process forward, and to have it launched as soon as possible so that we can start working a lot more closely with all the relevant mechanisms and also the external stakeholders to keep this transition process on track and to meet the various deadlines that has been set by the Security Council resolution, and also the planning process has communicated by our IoT. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Syria, thanks so much. I think everything that you've laid out in many ways concretizes a lot of the ideas and challenges, and also the evolution of thinking that the other panelists have laid out over the course of the session. We're unfortunately out of time for discussion, so I think I'm just going to end it here and thank everyone for their contributions. Convey my thanks to Ambassador Hoistjen, who had to leave, and Rachel, who also had to leave, and to thank you, Syria, Rania, and Daniel for your presentations today. It was a really excellent session, and Syria, good luck with the coming months as you get settled and the ongoing transition in DRC. So thanks to everyone for joining us today, and take care.